The otherworldly sounds of the synthesizer have changed the way that we hear music. One of the instrument's premier inventors lives in our region. Here's the story of Robert Moog and the Moog synthesizer.
Synthesizers are electronic musical instruments. They were designed from scratch to be an appropriate use of electronics for musical expression. The word means to put something together out of its component parts. And that was the original idea, that you'd have one part of a sound and another part and a third part, and you could use this electronic equipment to string all these parts together. Electronic musical instruments go back to the turn of the century. Some of the most early records were used to make traditional music. Now, the sounds were not traditional, but because they made traditional music, people thought that they were trying to imitate other instruments. And the word synthetic came to mind. Now, there's nothing synthetic about a synthesizer sound. The sound is synthesized, but it's a real electronic synthesized sound, not synthetic. The first ones we made were very large experimental instruments. They went in studios in universities, and then the people who made recorded music for a living began to use them. Still, they were inside studios, and you sort of took a couple hours to set it up to get the sound you want, and then you made that sound, and then you would set up again. Eventually, we developed the Mini Moog, which was a smaller instrument designed for musicians to use on stage. We took them into musical instrument stores, and the retailers would say, "What's that?" And we'd tell them, and they'd say, "You expect us to sell something like that with all those knobs and all those switches? Get out of here, you know." So the way we actually began selling them in stores is that after a retailer would say that, our salesman at the time would go out at night and find a group playing at the local Holiday Inn or Ramada Inn or whatever, and show this instrument to the keyboard player. The keyboard player would say, "Oh, wow, I know those sounds. How can I get one of those?" So the next morning, the salesman would take the keyboard player into the store and say to the retailer, "Okay, here's your first customer. Now let's have an order for 2 of them." Before switched-on Bach came up, the conventional wisdom in the music industry and among the general public was that sure, synthesizers could make funny noises and sure they could sound different, but they couldn't be used to make real music, real classical music. Well, it wasn't true, and Wendy Carlos, the creator of switched-on Bach, showed that it wasn't true. Keith Emerson was very visible. He was a very good keyboard player, and he had this tremendous theatrical sense of how to attract attention to what he was doing. I think he was the first one to really use a synthesizer for what it was, to make sounds that couldn't be made any other way. very first tune to use a synthesizer on a rock record was Lucky Man. And Keith made that record. He actually made it just a couple weeks after he got the instrument, and they were right in the middle of recording that album, their first album. He just more or less found something that seemed to work, and he instinctively knew how good that would sound. As I said, the first instruments that we made were experimental instruments, and we actually made them to order. Every musician had a different reaction. Some were scared to death, some were tickled that they had all this experimental capability. Some listeners were enthralled with the new sounds, and some listeners were shocked at the difference, at the strangeness of it all. The media of the time played up that strangeness aspect. It just looked good on, in a newspaper or on television to sort of make it something more spectacular and more different than it was. No, it was just an interesting process, working with musicians to find out what they needed and using electronic circuits, the new electronic circuits of the time, to make it possible to make those sounds. We never thought at all about what the future would bring. We had no idea that it would become popular or commercial, or that we'd even sell them when we first began. My old company, Moog Music, was sold to the Norlin Corporation, which is a big holding company of the 1970s. As it turns out, Norlin itself went bankrupt, went out of business in the 80s. The electronic musical instrument business is just about as volatile as the fashion industry. Instruments go in and out of fashion very fast. The technology changes. The sound of analog synthesizers like the Mini Moog and the ARP instruments was very popular in the early 70s. After that, other sounds came in, sounds that could be produced by digital instruments. And we had competition. It became a very big business. And by and large, most of us were not able to keep up with that competition. Oh, I think that's just another aspect of the fashion nature of the business. Things go out of fashion, and then they come back in fashion. I think it's funny. I'm sort of watching it like it's somebody else's show. Electronics in general, and electronic musical instruments in particular, have always been a hobby of mine. And when I was a teenager, I used to like to build these things. There were popular hobby projects of the time. Back then, you would buy individual components and actually solder them together and build chassis with vacuum tubes. It was very different than it is today, where everything is made halfway around the world, and you just buy things, circuit boards with everything already on them. Back then, it was just fun. It was sort of a nerdish recreation. I was a nerd. I don't function too well in very big industries. I function well in small operations like this one. The demand for theremins is small. It's what in marketing we call a niche product. A few people around the world want to have them. Yeah, we're going to stay here. We're building up Big Briar. There are two kinds of people. People who like to retain the familiar, who like to dwell on the past, and people who like to try new things. I'm certainly somebody who likes to try new things. I rarely want to go back and do what I've already done. I think today is every bit as exciting, but in a different way from the way it was 30 or 40 years ago.